Welcome everyone to the 2021 Ministry of Defence Humanist and Non-Religious Remembrance Service. The annual ceremony, now in its 7th year, provides a forum for humanists and non-religious military personnel, veterans, family members, and everyone who has been affected by war to commemorate the fallen in a manner that aligns with their worldview and belief. The reason we have remembrance is because it makes us stop and pause our busy lives to take the time out to reflect and contemplate upon the ultimate sacrifice that others have made on our behalf. Remembrance is not just about the past. It's also about the telling of a story, so it may become real and alive in the present and be effective in encouraging and directing life for the future. Today, we will be encouraged to recall the horrors of war and the heroism of individuals through the retelling of their personal stories. Through this process, we relive these past experiences so that the enormity of such events may become the inspiration for us to work for reconciliation. Today's remembrance will also remind us to rededicate a commitment towards living full and happy lives as part of this, helping other people do the same. It reminds us to make the one and very short life we have meaningful. Remembrance provides us the opportunity to share together in the here and now, generating hope for the future, a future that is built on reason, empathy, compassion, and respect for the dignity of all persons, regardless of their characteristics or nationality. Now we begin today's service with an introduction to the history of remembrance and what it means, narrated by Andrew Copson, Chief Executive of Humanists UK.
This is my 4th year at the Cenotaph, representing the non-religious at the National Remembrance Day ceremony. The government added a representative of Humanists UK 5 years ago because, as they said, many of those who've sacrificed themselves or who've supported people at war have been non-religious. Many of them had humanist beliefs. Many of those who are practicing remembrance today have humanist beliefs. And the government wanted to augment the religious representatives with someone who could stand and represent and honour all of those people. People ask what you feel at the Cenotaph, standing there, especially in that moment of silence. And in the first year, it definitely felt somewhat overwhelming. All around you are veterans, are currently serving people, are all the politicians and the dignitaries. And you feel a lot of pressure almost to think and to remember in the right way. I found myself in that moment though, thinking not about the grand nature of the occasion and the uniforms and the dignitaries and the flags and the bishop's robes, but about the people that I knew personally who'd experienced war and hardship, loss and suffering, the friends I had who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, or thinking back to other wars, my own family, not just those who'd served and fought, but the women who'd stayed at home and struggled, who'd watched bombs falling from the doorstep. And they were the people who were in my thoughts, people with whom I had a personal connection. I think probably that's what a lot of people are thinking about in that particular moment, because you start with what you know, and then gradually your sympathies widen, you take a step back, and you can think about all the other people who, just like the people you know, were suffering, were sacrificing, and went through all those hardships and made those sacrifices. And that, I think, is where remembrance starts, even in the grandest of places, even at the Cenotaph. It starts in the corners of our own hearts, our own lives, our own relationships. The Cenotaph itself is an incredible symbol and opportunity for remembrance when you're standing there during the moment of silence, not quite knowing where to look. If you look at the Cenotaph, it is incredibly powerful. Not only when it was built were its proportions aesthetically pleasing, it's a beautiful, impressive but not domineering structure. It's also deliberately designed to be an inclusive place of remembrance. There are no religious symbols on the Cenotaph. That's a deliberate decision because the people who died were of diverse worldviews, religious and non-religious. It's a simple object. And at the same time, it's a pure and clear one. When you're looking at it, free of distraction and focusing on it, that brings a sort of meditation to your remembrance, thinking about the suffering by using that physical object there. I find it really, as an object, just one of the most powerful symbols of remembrance that there can be.
Now we move on to the recalling and reliving of personal stories from those of past operations. We begin with Noel Godfrey Chavez, and the theme of the value that he has is service.
In keeping with the theme of how human values can inspire extraordinary courage and benevolence, I'll be remembering the story of Noel Godfrey Chavez, the only person to be awarded the Victoria Cross twice in the First World War, and only one of 3 people to have ever achieved this distinction. Noel Chavez qualified as a doctor in 1912 and joined the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1913. He'd achieved the rank of captain by the time of the outbreak of the First World War. And by the end of 1915, he'd already been awarded the Military Cross and mentioned in dispatches. Chavez was awarded his first VC for his actions on 9th of August 1916 at Guillemont, France, where he attended to the wounded all day. The full citation read, "For most conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty." During an attack, he tended to the wounded in the open all day, under heavy fire, frequently in view of the enemy. During the ensuing night, he searched for wounded on the ground in front of the enemy's lines for 4 hours. Next day, he took one stretcher bearer to the advanced trenches and under heavy shell fire carried an urgent case of 500 yards into safety, being wounded in the side by a shell splinter during the journey. The same night, he took up a party of 20 volunteers, rescued 3 wounded men from a shell hole 25 yards from the enemy's trench, buried the bodies of 2 officers and collected many identity discs, while they were fired on by bombs and machine guns. Altogether, he saved the lives of some 20 badly wounded men, besides the ordinary cases which passed through his hands. His courage and self-sacrifice were beyond praise. Chavez's second award was made during the period 31st July to 2nd of August 1917. The citation read, "For most conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty when in action." Though severely wounded early in the action whilst carrying a wounded soldier to the dressing station, Captain Chavez refused to leave his post, and for 2 days not only continued to perform his duties, but in addition went out repeatedly under heavy fire to search for and attend to the wounded who were lying out. During these searches, although practically without food during this period, worn with fatigue and faint with his wound, he assisted to carry in a number of badly wounded men over heavy and difficult ground. By his extraordinary energy and inspiring example, he was instrumental in rescuing many wounded who would have otherwise undoubtedly succumbed under the bad weather conditions. This devoted and gallant officer subsequently died of his wounds. For me, that Chavez's remarkable courage was not a heroic act to defeat or kill an enemy, but instead was founded in acts of mercy. To put his life at risk to save others is remarkable. That he did so repeatedly, even when injured, with wounds that were ultimately to cost him his life, shows the true strength of humanity, even in the most difficult of circumstances possible. I will remember Noel Chavez. I will remember all of those who've lost their lives in conflict.
The second story of today is Eileen Ren, and the value is loyalty.
The value we are looking at is loyalty, adopted from the Royal Navy. The nation, the naval service and those with whom we serve rely on our commitment, dedication and support. We must therefore be loyal to our leaders, those we lead, our team and our duty. Loyalty was demonstrated by Eileen Ren, a heroine of the Second World War, a brilliant and courageous spy who helped liberate occupied France. Eileen Ren, better known as Dee Dee, was born in London in March 1921, the youngest of 4 children. In 1923, the family moved to France. but when Germany invaded, they made their way back to England. Back in England, Eileen wanted to serve her country and was recruited by the SOE, known as Churchill's Secret Army. To begin with, Eileen was an operator based out of London. However, in March 1944, at only 23 years old, she was parachuted into occupied France. Eileen's mission was to help maintain a Paris intelligence network known as Wizard. Despite experiencing several narrow escapes, Eileen stayed loyal, ensuring her duty was carried out. Eventually, she was discovered by the German Gestapo in a deserted farmhouse just outside of Paris. Eileen was already unsure how safe she was to transmit from that location, but the importance of the message made her undertake the task anyway. Eileen hardly ever spoke of what happened to her at the hands of the Gestapo during her interrogation. We know she underwent severe torture. She was stripped naked and then repeatedly submerged into icy water, almost drowning her in the process. There was repeated blackouts due to the lack of oxygen. She was beaten, insulted, and housed in the most diabolical conditions. Eileen's loyalty was unwavering. Despite being treated in such a dreadful way, she refused to divulge even a snippet of information and kept to her cover story. The loyalty and bravery Eileen had already shown continued, and in August 1944, with her head shaven and emotionally traumatised, she was sent to Ravensbrück, where thousands lost their lives. There she was threatened with execution and tortured repeatedly, but she never deviated from her story, no matter how brutal it got. Eileen's loyalty to her colleagues and to her duty meant she maintained her brave silence, ensuring the safety of her SOE colleagues stationed in France, multiple members of the resistance, the integrity of the coding practice, and the continuation of their work. Over the next few months, Eileen was moved across various labour camps, and in April 1945, she escaped. Enduring several nights without food, she took refuge and lapsed into unconsciousness. She was picked up by the Americans and a few weeks later was back in England. When her post-war debriefers asked her how she maintained hope through such vexing times, she replied, "The will to live, willpower. You should never let yourself go. I remember what we had been taught. Never be afraid, never let them dominate you. It seemed that the end would never come, but I always believed in destiny, and I had hope." When she finally came back to England, she was in a state of physical and emotional collapse. The war had left her badly traumatised, and she gradually disappeared into obscurity. She never sought attention or recognition for her efforts during the war, and once told an interviewer, "It was a life in the shadows. I could be hard and secret. I could be lonely. I could be independent, but I was never bored." Eileen passed away on September the 2nd, 2010. She was recognised for her efforts by both France and Britain and awarded a Croix de Guerre and a civil MBE. Her glowing recommendation for her MBE stated, "For 5.5 months she maintained constant communication with London from this most dangerous area, and by her cool efficiency, perseverance and willingness to undergo any risk in order to carry out her work, made possible the successful organisation of her group and the delivery of large quantities of arms and equipment." She was given a funeral with full military honours, and at her wishes, her ashes were scattered at sea. Eileen Ren will be remembered as a loyal and brave British citizen.
Now we move on to the third story of today's service, Eric Lomax, and the value that he demonstrated was respect for others.
Eric Lomax was a Second World War Royal Signals officer attached to the 5th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery. As a lieutenant, he had been captured by the Japanese following the surrender of Singapore in February 1942. He, along with other Far East prisoners of war, undertook a forced march to Changi prison before he was then taken to Kanchanaburi, Thailand, and forced to build the notorious Burma Railway. By day, the prisoners laboured in temperatures exceeding 38 degrees centigrade. By night, they slept on wooden planks in dismal bamboo huts. Nearly all the men were depleted from malnutrition and disease, and they were dying by the score. To obtain war news, Lomax and a few other prisoners had secretly built a radio receiver. Lomax also drew a map of the area around the railway to aid in possible escape attempts. A guard found Lomax's map and he was singled out. He was ordered to stand to attention all day in the scorching sun without food or water. That night, Lomax was ordered to raise his arms above his head. A soldier swung the wooden handle of a pickaxe across the man's back, knocking him over. Other guards began beating and kicking him until Lomax lost consciousness. Days later, he was brought before a shaven-headed NCO, Takashi Nagase, for interrogation. In fluent English, Nagase accused Lomax of anti-Japanese activities. The interrogation went on for hours. Nagase was always on hand as interpreter, telling him to confess, to admit his so-called crimes. "Are you ready to talk?" Nagase asked. Lomax shook his head. On the 5th day, Lomax was accused of being a spy. He was dragged out onto the banks of the River Kwai, laid on his back and tied down. One broken arm behind his back, the other bound to his chest. He was in agony. A towel was then put over his face, a faucet was turned on at full force, and the water soaked through, blocking Lomax's nose and mouth. He frantically gasped for breath as water filled his throat. He was drowning on dry land. His torture continued for several more days. Eventually, Lomax was tried in court in Bangkok and sent to a disease-ridden prison in Singapore. He stayed there until the war ended, when he hoped his suffering would finish, but both the physical and mental damage remained. It was a constant reminder of his suffering, and he remained darkly obsessed with his torturers, especially the interpreter. In October 1989, a friend gave Lomax a newspaper clipping about the publication of Crosses and Tigers, a book by Takashi Nagase. The article spoke of Nagase's remorse over Japanese atrocities and his public acts of atonement to his victims. In the correspondence with Lomax's wife which followed, Nagase wrote, "I have suffered tremendous guilt all these years. I have often prayed I would meet your husband again and be able to seek forgiveness for what I assisted in." And so, almost 50 years later, Lomax travelled back to the Far East. When Nagase reached Lomax, he bowed deeply. "I am so very sorry," he said softly. "I would like..." His voice cracked and he began to cry. On instinct, Lomax put out his hand and Nagase clasped it tightly. They sat together in silence on a nearby bench. Finally, Lomax spoke. "Do you remember what you said to me when we last met?" "No, I don't," Nagase replied. "You said keep your chin up." Lomax paused and then smiled. The tension began to vanish. The day before they were to part, Lomax handed Nagase a letter he had written the night before. "I think you would like to have this," he said. Nagase unfolded the page and read the words. "Although I can't forget the ill treatment at Kanchanaburi, taking account of your change of heart, your apologies, the work you are doing, please accept my total forgiveness." Nagase looked up and grasped Lomax's hand. Both men had tears in their eyes. "I've learned that hate is a useless battle," Lomax said, "and it has to end sometime."
The final story of today's service is Charles Upham, who demonstrated the value of courage.
I've been asked to speak on the theme of courage, and there can be no greater mark of courage in Britain's armed forces than the award of the Victoria Cross. The VC was first awarded in 1857 to soldiers who had participated in the Crimean War. It is awarded for most conspicuous bravery or some daring or pre-eminent act of valour or self-sacrifice or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy. I want to tell you about one soldier who was awarded the VC not once, but twice. Only 3 people have been awarded VC and Bar. Charles Upham was one of them, and the only one to have been a fighting soldier, the other 2 being doctors who received the award for rescuing wounded soldiers under fire. Upham was a Kiwi who enlisted in September 1939, signing on as a private. In December of that year he was promoted to sergeant, and a week later sailed for Egypt. He began officer training in July 1940 and earned his first VC as a second lieutenant in the Battle for Crete in May 1941. Courage usually comes with character, and when informed of the award, Upham is reported to have said, "It's meant for the men." The VC citation tells of a succession of intense and violent engagements over several days, often at very close quarters, during which Second Lieutenant Upham was badly wounded and suffered dysentery throughout, fought on regardless, and led his men to significant tactical victories. Let me read an extract from the citation. During the operations in Crete, this officer performed a series of remarkable exploits, showing outstanding leadership, tactical skill, and utter indifference to danger. He showed superb coolness, great skill and dash, and complete disregard of danger. His conduct and leadership inspired his whole platoon to fight magnificently throughout, and in fact was an inspiration to the battalion. Promoted to captain, Charles Upham was evacuated to Egypt. In July 1942, he found himself participating in the First Battle of El Alamein. Again, the citation tells a tale of immense courage and leadership under fire. In spite of being twice wounded, Captain Upham insisted on remaining with his men to take part in the final assault. Although he was shot through the elbow by a machine gun bullet, he went on again to a forward position and brought back some of his men who had become isolated. Exhausted by pain from his wound and weak from loss of blood, Captain Upham was then removed to the regimental aid post, but immediately his wound had been dressed, he returned to his men, remaining with them all day under heavy artillery and mortar fire until he was again severely wounded. When the recommendation was made for a second VC, King George VI remarked that a bar to the cross would be very unusual indeed, and asked, "Does he deserve it?" The response came back, "In my respectful opinion, sir, Upham won the VC several times over." Having been captured at El Alamein, he spent time as a prisoner of war in Italy, attempting multiple escapes. Eventually he ended up in the famous Colditz Castle, from where he was liberated by American forces. He joined an American unit so that he could re-enter the war, but was instead sent to Britain. I've already said that courage and character are intertwined. When Charles Upham returned to New Zealand after the war with his wife Molly, who he had married in England in 1945, the local community raised money to buy him a farm. But Upham insisted that the money should instead be spent on an educational scholarship for the children of ex-servicemen. Part of courage is selflessness. Charles Upham clearly demonstrated this in abundance. What a remarkable man. An example to us all, and a reminder that courage, whether physical, mental or moral, is a prerequisite for military service.
Now we have the first song from the London Humanist Choir. The long day closes.
No star is o'er the lake, its pale watch keeping. The moon is half awake, through rain is creeping. The last red leaves fall round the porch of roses. The clock has ceased to sound. The long day closes. Sit by the silent hearth in calm endeavor to count the sounds of mirth. Now
Now we move on to the roll call part of the service, and this is where we remember each operation from World War I onwards, read by serving members of the military, and with each operation we align a verse of remembrance.
Known as the Great War, it lasted from the 28th of July 1914 to the 11th of November 1918. It led to the mobilization of more than 70 million military personnel, including 60 million Europeans, making it the largest war in history at the time. It was also one of the deadliest conflicts, with an estimated 9 million combatant and 7 million civilian deaths as a direct result of the war.
In the rising of the sun and its going down, we will remember them.
World War II was a global war that lasted from 1939 to 1945. It was the deadliest conflict in human history, marked by 70 to 85 million fatalities, most of whom were civilians in the Soviet Union and in China. It included massacres, the genocide of the Holocaust, strategic bombing, premeditated death from starvation and disease, and the only use of nuclear weapons in war.
In the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we remember them.
The Korean War began on the 25th of June 1950, when some 75,000 military personnel from the North Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel, the boundary between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea of the north and the pro-Western Republic of Korea in the south. The Korean War ended in July 1954. In all, some 5 million military personnel and civilians lost their lives during this war, including 1,129 members of the British Armed Forces.
In the opening of the buds and the rebirth of spring, we will remember them.
South Arabia. The Aden Emergency from 1963 to 1967 was an insurgency against British rule in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. Aden was defended by the South Arabian Army, who the British supported against nationalist groups such as the National Liberation Front, who targeted British troops and their families. In all, the British Army suffered 90 personnel killed and 510 wounded.
When we have joys that we yearn to share, we remember them.
Upham was the name for the British Armed Forces operation in Northern Ireland from 1969 to 2007, known locally as the Troubles. It was the longest continuous deployment in British military history. More than 3,500 people were killed in the conflict, of whom 52% were civilians, 32% were members of the British security forces, and 16% were members of the paramilitary groups.
In the blueness of the skies and in the warmth of the summer, we remember them.
The Falklands War occurred from April to October 1982, undeclared war between Argentina and the United Kingdom in 1982 over 2 British dependent territories in the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands and its territorial dependency, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. In total, 907 were killed during the 74 days of conflict.
In the rustling of the leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we will remember them.
Known as Op Granby, this was the first Gulf War, lasting from the 2nd of August 1990 to the 28th of February 1991, and was instigated by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Coalition forces lost 392 dead, including 47 British service persons. Iraqi battle deaths were estimated between 20 and 35,000, while over 3,000 civilians were killed due to airstrikes.
In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember them.
Operation Grapple was the UK support to the UN peacekeeping missions in the former Yugoslavia from October 1992 until December 1995 as part of the UN Protection Force. Eventually, British Armed Forces would serve nearly 15 years in Bosnia, seeing more than 72 comrades killed and many more wounded. The civilian death toll estimates that around 100,000 people were killed during the conflict.
When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them.
Op Eric was the British operation in Afghanistan. Conducted from 2001 to the end of combat operations in 2014, it consisted of the British contribution to the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force and support to the American-led Operation Enduring Freedom. Between 2001 and September 2021, 456 British military personnel have died on operations in Afghanistan.
When we are lost and sick of heart, we will remember them.
Op-Telek was the United Kingdom's military operations in Iraq, conducted between the start of the invasion on the 19th of March 2003 until the withdrawal of the last remaining British forces on the 22nd of May 2011. A total of 178 British Armed Forces personnel died serving on Operation Telek, with 3,598 British personnel wounded, injured or fell ill.
For as long as we live, they too shall live, for we remember them.
That concludes the recalling and reliving element of the service. We'll now move on to the Ode to Remembrance, which will include the last post, 2-minute silence and reveille. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today.
Now we move on to the second song from a London Humanist choir, For the Fallen. We will remember them.
They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We will
We move on to the reconciliation part of today's service, where we're inspired to reconcile our feelings and importance, to strive to maintain peace and avoid war in future.
My grandfather was wounded at the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, and after a long recovery, didn't return to active service, but transferred to a labour corps working on military cemeteries behind the lines. And then at the war's end, he joined the Imperial War Graves Commission and continued working there in northern France and Belgium, respectively Picardy and Flanders, for the next several years into the 1920s. I never knew my grandfather. He died some years before I was born. And as he was a taciturn, introverted man, he spoke very little to his son, my father, about his experiences, except in one striking respect, which was that he intimated that his work with the War Graves Commission had made a big difference to him in his view of the war and of the world. He had gone to war as an enthusiast, but had suffered severe trauma, psychologically and physically, and had lost many comrades. So during his long convalescence, he was in what, so I gathered, was a confused state of anger and bitterness, especially towards the enemy. But the experience of his years of work with the War Graves Commission changed that. The painstaking effort to recover remains, names, details of the lost, finding bodies not just of British, Australian, Canadian, South African soldiers, but of Indian troops and Chinese labourers attached to the British forces. And most particularly, some experiences of having to separate the remains of British and German soldiers mingled together, their corpses lying side by side, some distinguishable only by scarcely recognisable scraps of uniform. Returning German dead to officials of the Volksbund, the German equivalent of the War Graves Commission, was a telling experience. It was a stark revelation of human commonalities, of the consilience of humanity, the underlying connectedness. The vast sorrow of that conflict was very poignantly felt in the quiet and systematic effort to commemorate every lost individual. So many remained unidentifiable, making it all the more urgent that there should be means of commemorating them nonetheless. But it was the fact that war didn't discriminate among its victims. Suffering and the sacrifices were the same on both sides. My grandfather, it seems, in the years that he spent with the War Graves Commission, came to see that peace was made and reconciliation most emphatically effected between those who fought one another in the deaths they shared. Deaths which in that horrendous conflict were meant to end war forever, so that the peace they found in death would translate into peace for the living, so that people would reconcile their differences before going to war, before having to seek reconciliation after conflict. But he himself found reconciliation in those years of serving the dead, all of them on all sides united in one great regiment together, in the vast silence they had fallen into from the roar and tumult of battle. As is often said, when the fighting stops, a harder and grander work begins of the different kinds of reconciliation, reconciling with the former enemy, with oneself and one's memories, with those lost because better ways of managing relationships in our world had failed, and with those grieving those lost, the rest of their lives marked by the unendingness of loss. My grandfather achieved these several kinds of reconciliation, so my father gave me to understand, and I recognized that he would be far from alone among the many who have experienced war, and the many whose families have been marked by grief for loved ones lost in war. Our best hope lies in reconciliation, because reconciliation now is a support for peace in future. Maintaining resentments and bitterness threatens resumption of conflict in future, as we see from the experience of too many places from Northern Ireland to the Balkans and elsewhere. We are humanists, and humanism is, among other things, about approaching others with generosity and sympathy, vital ingredients of reconciliation, a word that literally means bringing together again, restoring connections. My grandfather, it seems, learned how much we are one world, one human family, and he learned these ingredients of reconciliation, generosity and sympathy, from his experience of laying out war cemeteries. In remembering all the lost of past conflicts, we can remember and apply that same lesson about reconciliation and the oneness of humanity to strengthen us today in our resolve for a peaceful future.
Now we move on to the rededication part of the service, where we rededicate our commitment on how we can live full and happy lives, and as part of this, help others do the same.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be able to say a few words to you on this momentous day. My name is Erwin Kamp. I've been working for 22 years as a Humanist chaplain with the Dutch Armed Forces. I went on a lot of exercise with the Royal Dutch Marines and I was deployed twice. Since 2016, I have been Chief of Humanistic Chaplaincy at the Ministry of Defense. In the Netherlands, there are 39 Humanist chaplains working in the armed forces, and we are one of the three major services alongside Roman Catholic and Protestant spiritual care. During this rededication, we recognize and pay tribute to those who made the ultimate sacrifice. On a day like today, we reflect on the people who died for our freedom and that of others. For example, from 2006, the Netherlands deployed more than 30,000 troops to Afghanistan. During these missions, 25 Dutch soldiers died. Their deaths remind us to make the most of our lives. The last few months have taught us how vulnerable we are and how fragile freedom can sometimes be. The sudden departure of NATO from Afghanistan has left deep wounds, not only in the local people, but also in our veterans. I've rarely heard so often the questioning of the purpose of a mission. Was it all worth it? Should our departure from Afghanistan have been gradual? What was the point of all of this? I suspect that these questions are asked of all countries that deployed troops and civilians to Afghanistan. Besides a large number of physically and mentally wounded soldiers, I also speak to many veterans who suffer from a moral injury. They speak of broken trust and struggle with guilt and shame. They believe we have now left the Afghans to fend for themselves. They see their work built up for years fade away in one fell swoop. Sometimes they also feel that they have been betrayed by their government. In the Netherlands, we were not allowed to call the deployment to Afghanistan a combat mission. Soldiers were sent out with orders to rebuild. President Biden recently said that the mission to Afghanistan had never been a rebuilding mission. Who should soldiers believe now? Which government is telling the honest story behind Afghanistan? In recent years, a great initiative was undertaken in the Netherlands. Throughout the Netherlands, each of 25 bridges has been given the name of a fallen veteran. It's a very visible way of reminding society of the sacrifice they made. It's a tribute that is everlasting and ensures that their deaths had not been forgotten. It also makes us realize that we are part of a larger whole. The veteran is a part of the armed forces. The armed forces are part of the Dutch society. The Netherlands is part of NATO. NATO stands for the protection and defense of our Western values. Values based on liberty, equality and brotherhood. Values that do not apply in Afghanistan and where fundamental human rights are violated. Rights of women, homosexuals and disabled. In the Netherlands, the Humanist Association celebrates its 75th anniversary this year. We celebrated this in the presence of our King. In addition, in Amsterdam, a special exhibition was opened which reflects on the important freethinkers in the history of our country, from Erasmus to Spinoza. And this year I was allowed to speak as a humanist for the first time in 25 years at our National Remembrance Day on the 4th of May on Dam Square in Amsterdam. My wish for the future is that we will live together in peace and freedom. May the sacrifice made by our veterans and the pain and sorrow caused by their family and friends not have been in vain. Let our rational mind prevail over our unsubstantiated emotions. Let humanity triumph over inhumanity. Allow tolerance and let tolerance into our hearts to ensure greater diversity and inclusion. Let we humans live as humans and allow the best of ourselves to come out. Thank you.
We move on to the final song from the London Humanist Choir, Shenandoah. The human condition is one of vulnerability. Our fate may be terrible, and there may be no consolation. To recognize fragility is to accept that we are vulnerable to circumstances. But we're also vulnerable to our own feelings. Just as there are no guarantees all will be well in the future, so also there are no guarantees in human nature that we will, through our own resources, be able to create a perfect world. Just as we have to acknowledge, as we have done here today, the terrible things that can happen to us, so also we have to acknowledge that we too could do terrible things. These are grounds for sober realism, but not for despair. The ideal to which we can aspire is not a remote, non-human ideal. It is one which is formed from our experiences of what human beings are capable of at their best. It is an ideal that comes from within our own humanity, from within our inherent human values. We may face many challenges, including crime, injustice, and violence. Some may not take advantage of their abilities, and others use them in ways that should not be celebrated. Not everyone will use their life to do good things, answering big questions or improving the quality of life for humankind. However, we believe we should all be encouraged to do so. We should make the most of our talents and abilities. We have made great progress, and we have the potential to do so in the future. Today, we have had the opportunity to reaffirm the building of a more humane society tomorrow, through altruism, positive regard for others, and above all, treating each other as we would have them treat us. We finish today with a poem on remembrance, read by the Ministry of Defence's Faith and Belief champion, Gianfranco Mansi.
Remember Me by Harry Riley, 2012. Remember me. Duty called and I went to war, though I'd never fired a gun before. I paid the price for your new day, as all my dreams were blown away. Remember me. We all stood true as whistles blew, and faced the shell and stench of hell. Now battle's done, there is no sound. Our bones decay beneath the ground. We cannot see or smell or hear. There is no death or hope or fear. Remember me. Once we, like you, would laugh and talk, and run and walk and do the things that you all do. But now we lie in rows so neat, beneath the soil beneath your feet. Remember me. In mud and gore and the blood of war, we fought and fell and moved no more. Remember me, I am not dead. I'm just a voice within your head.